Chapter 8, on the basis of race, attitude, and identity. Well, if you made it this far, it means you'll have survived 8 episodes of hard-hitting challenges, stories, and conversations. I guess now is as good a time as any to tell you that it doesn't end here. This might be the season finale, but what we've started here is far from over. In the future, I'll do my best to curate and cultivate stories that matter, stories that need to be human, stories that tell about the human experience and how it shapes all of us. So, one last time, from the Hyman blog and Press Play podcast, I'm JD Hyman. As a Black man living here in America, I am living proof that while all men were created equal, not all men are equal. You're here to dig into the American political system, explore and unearth experiences from the human condition, and be a catalyst for some hard conversations that need to be had. No matter what brought you here, I'm glad you came. Once again, my name is JD, and this is the Hyman Podcast.
Stony the road we trod as Black people, blending into a darkness that we didn't dispense, blacking out the sky like it's 8:46. We are always geared up for unpredictable war. We stay with the breastplate, teaching our children to love every race but still be safe. The sons and daughters of chained up slaves, yet we've been deemed unsafe. The most violent among any race, yet we can still smell the wet cries hanging from worn trees, while those who tied the death ropes deemed their own hands clean. So systemic racism was just a bad dream. A moment of silence for all the Black lives that matter. History that's tattered, but the silence gets shattered, not by resuscitating those who currently need a medic, but by the chance of all lives matter, because it hurts too much to be empathetic to emotional and physical caskets dilapidated from masters, while the living are above ground screaming, we are the ones who matter too. Giving the bereaved no time to grieve, expecting healing to happen at lightning speed. The world providing no relief, but asking Black people, what's wrong with you? Pull up the strap on your boot. No need to deal with the root. You're already 6 feet under somebody else's boot. This is a terrifying racism epidemic. We have already been 6 feet apart, socially distant. America, we just want to know that when it is time to stand with Black people, that you won't leave us hanging in a tree or under injustice's suffocating knee, because when we can't breathe, we need you to speak. When injustice won't quit, we don't need you to be complicit by your deafening silence, aka an accomplice, but we need you on the stony road for what must be accomplished. That we too might taste the sweet, sweet land of liberty. That the definition of equality include Black people without excuse. That when you see the deep pain in us, you understand that your life can't matter until ours matters too. Because to do the opposite would make the definition of equality untrue.
That was Renika Cheney. I heard a piece she did, and I was compelled to have her contribute to the final episode of this season, and she did so without reservation. I am so glad she did, because that was epic. When we started this journey, I told you why I wanted to start this podcast. I wanted to have honest conversations, both with myself and the people around me. I wanted to view different situations through different lenses of other people who hold different beliefs and views than myself. I wanted to express my thoughts, my opinions, and the things that bring me pain. I wanted to do all these things in a way that holds true to the nature of my character. I believe honest conversations are how we bridge gaps, marshal change, and catalyze people to a cause. And all those things, I believe the single greatest instrument at one's disposal is their voice. And then there's where I come in. We've been on a journey to understand racism in America, its effect on the human condition, the Black male, and society as a whole. We explored the intransigent nature of society that built a system that was flawed by its very design, which in effect meant it was designed to marginalize the voices of the minority. We dug into the roots of the American political system, an all-powerful machine that preys on the ignorance of the American electorate for the sake of power and influence. And finally, we explored my own personal experiences and what brought me and a tired people to this point, to the point of violence, rioting, looting, and non-stop protests. We looked at the indifference of law and order and why it took so long for Ahmaud Arbery's murderers to get arrested and why Breonna Taylor's murderers still walk free. So yeah, this fight is far from over, but I hope that through listening to this podcast, you have a better idea of what is actually happening in our society. But there's still one more topic I'd like to address as we close out this series. I first mentioned it in the last episode. I was talking about my experience as a student at a small, predominantly white institution in Ohio, where I learned a behavior where 13 years later, I'm still trying to unlearn. This is what this episode's about. Part 1, on the basis of race. I'm approximately 189 centimeters tall and weighing in at approximately 129 kilograms. In English, that's a little over 6 feet 2 inches tall and 265 pounds. Notice the difference? I've had this stature my entire adult life. In fact, I think the last time I weighed under 260 pounds was freshman year or sophomore year in high school. And all the while, I didn't know I was built like a linebacker until the summer I started conditioning with the football team. And even then, it wasn't so much intimidating because most of the other guys were monstrous as well. When I finally moved to Ohio, I was in a different world. I towered over most people. I wore clothes only found in urban populations. Now I was surrounded by skinny white guys whose wardrobes consisted of Hollister and Aeropostale, and girls who had just learned it was okay to shop somewhere other than the softer side of Sears. Next to most of these people, I looked incredibly out of place. And it wasn't just a look, it was also a feeling. One day, I was coming out of my dorm and a girl standing near the door was startled when I opened the door. I'm not sure who she was expecting, but the look of fear and terror in her eyes spoke volumes. She wasn't expecting me. Her body language. She clutched herself in a protective posture, almost shielding herself. I'd never thought of myself as intimidating, but apparently I was. And when I learned that it wasn't just the girls who felt that way, but also some of the guys, I became pretty self-conscious of who I was. I knew who I was, and I didn't want people to think of me as an intimidating person. And this is excluding my time as an angry black male, of course. Anyways, so I started to use humor to lighten the mood whenever possible. I started to smile more, laugh at dumb jokes, laugh at my own expense, and whenever possible, I tried to make myself seem inadequate. Yes, I tried to make myself seem inadequate. I wanted a disposition that was so disarming that no one would look at me in fear ever again. As time went on and people got to know me, it was no longer necessary to make myself small for the sake of my surroundings, but for whatever reason, I was broken. I couldn't help myself. I wouldn't notice it, but it would always be after the fact. JD, who are you? Who have you become? What are you trying to prove? It wasn't until I met people like Karen Valentine and Kate Mogan that I realized it was okay for me to just be me. I asked myself those questions again and again and again, and to no avail. Like I said, I smiled more, I laughed more, took the bass out of my voice whenever I met someone for the first time, kept a distance from them in an attempt to make people think it was I who was the one who was actually afraid. I tried to make myself as small as I possibly could. There are some bad habits out there, but this one takes the cake. Here I was trying to make myself inexistent without even considering what it was actually doing to me. Over the years, I started to see the world change. The issue of race once again became a dominating issue in all the news cycles. I found that being Black in America meant embracing myself for who I am. But by the time I came to that realization, I think it done more damage than I cared to admit. For a long time, I ignored the topic of race, so much so that when I finally started to speak out about racial injustice, it was almost as if people were realizing for the first time since knowing me that I was actually, in fact, a Black man. In some of the conversations I've had recently, people came to some harsh realizations. They came to realize that being Black in America comes with its own set of challenges, but for me, one of the greatest challenges is seeing how much people just don't get it. The ignorance of such a large amount of people is truly bewildering. It's great when they come to the realization that systemic racism is an actual thing, but it's also so painful to think that it's going to take a monumental effort to get the rest of the nation on board with this concept. My hope is that this podcast, this episode in particular, makes its way around the general public and that it does more of the work for me. I don't want to force my views or ideas onto anyone. In fact, I think it's more effective when people come to these realizations all on their own. For the ones who would rather try and convince me that I'm crazy with skew beliefs, let's go through with logic and reason. Assumption 1. Systemic racism does not exist. Assumption 2. Ignoring systemic racism will not have an adverse effect on the overall human condition. Assumption 3. Denying the existence of systemic racism on every possible level will have an ameliorating effect on the overall human condition. The thing is, these assumptions are built upon a first principle. That is to say that maintaining order in society as a whole and the overall human condition is more important than a single person's life. But there's a flaw in that logic, because history has shown us time and time again that a single human life is worth more than all the peace in the world. We don't falter at our failures, nor should we have to. There have been times when I've refused to accept certain truths, and most of the time that was because I was unwilling to relinquish my own hubris. I think the same thing can be said about a lot of different things in a lot of different places in life. There are things in this life that I will never be able to attain, and as much as I recognize that, I do not accept it. I do not accept it because while race has and will hold me back, I don't have to let it. More on that after the break.
Hello, Brooks here with the Books with Brooks monthly book club podcast. We read one book a month and then we talk about it. Books like Stephen King's The Shining or Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. If you're on the hunt for book recommendations and enjoy sparkling conversation, come read along with us and then listen in.
Hey everyone, it's Cameron Justice, co-host of the Orange is Orange or Browns podcast. Make sure you check us out for everything Browns. We got you covered before the game, after the game. Here are our takes, here are our feedback, here are our criticisms, and our praises. If you like the Browns, you're going to love this podcast.
I'm Dennis Maniloff, co-host along with the roadman Kenny Rhoda of the Next Man Up podcast, part of the Press Play Podcast Network. Roadman and I do a deep dive into Browns, Indians, Cavs, Ohio State, and anything else that's on the sports fan's mind.
Hey, it's JD with a quick message on how you can help support the Hyman Podcast. In the upcoming season, the Hyman Podcast is looking for new sponsors. If you're a business owner or a brand and you're interested in reaching a large and diverse audience, let's partner together. Contact me at podcast@jdhyman.com. Part 2, on the basis of attitude. When we come to the end of life, I'd like to think that I had an opportunity to explore life from many different points of view, not just my own. I don't want to go through life never having tried to understand someone else, especially someone who doesn't share my same views. I believe in equality and equity. I believe all people get to express their views regardless because I believe that all speech is free. I accept that there are differences among us, and I think that fact alone is what makes society worth being part of. I believe all these things because I've been in situations where the people who are supposed to love me the most have ostracized me for daring to express my own opinions. To be clear, I don't believe that society is broken, but I do believe some of its systems are. And the systems that are broken serve the favor of some people, and for others, well, it's just a system that doesn't work. I don't fault this brokenness on any one person. I don't think one person has that much power, nor should the illusion that one person has that much power exist in the first place. I believe attitude is a strong indicator of a person's character and can sometimes be a litmus test for a person's ability to marshal change and catalyze movements. But it requires an undeniable iron will and an uncontestedly steely resolve. Black people in this nation have been faced with a struggle not known to many people, and while some contend that the issues faced by Black America are inconsequential, an overwhelming majority contend that they are immutable. Whether it's poverty, the wealth gap, the high numbers of incarcerated individuals, high school dropouts, there's a lot against us. We're fighting an uphill battle, and all the while, we're being bogged down by politics, racism, inequity, and an unrelenting, unyielding fear of being targeted and killed, whether by the police or people who think they're the police. And yet still, we're supposed to remain cool, calm, and collected in the face of prejudice, adversity, and in constant circumstances that are extraordinarily good at backing us into a corner. In Chapter 6, I talked about the angry Black man. Well, in case this is news, I wasn't the first, and I absolutely won't be the last. And along with the angry Black man is the angry Black woman, who many contend is fueled by more grievances than the angry Black man. The Black woman has to deal with the same varying challenges as the Black man, but add to that the simple fact that they are also women puts them at an even greater disadvantage than their male counterparts. That's partly why this battle is so begrudging. We're fighting for equality on so many levels. Our attitudes are a reflection of how the world both perceives us and treats us. Earlier, I talked about how I try to make myself small so as to not appear threatening. Wow. I let the perception of the world shape how I conducted myself, how I presented myself to the world, and in doing so, I was dishonest with everyone I've ever met, save for a few people who, over the years, got to really know the real me. But more than that, I was dishonest with myself. There have been so many situations where the angry Black man or the angry Black woman is exploding, and it's spun negatively because that attitude doesn't mesh well with what some white people would consider civil. I showed cowardice in how I presented myself. I thought it was a polite thing to do. I thought I needed to change who I was in order to make other people comfortable. And in doing that, the only thing I had accomplished was fueling an internal battle I most certainly would never win. Many people take the attitudes of angry Black people to be an affront to everything except what is actually an affront to: broken promises and both overt and systemic racism. And as inflammatory as that statement is, We have to remember that this isn't new. After all, it was Will Smith who said that racism wasn't getting worse. It's just getting filmed. Now, this attitude thing, it works both ways, because in the same way Black people have an attitude with the way we're treated or the way we're portrayed in the media, we have to address that white people have a certain attitude towards certain Black people or certain stereotypes that involve Black people. Regardless of what that attitude is, at the end of the day, I believe it's not a race issue at all, but a heart issue. I think we need to recognize the level of complacency in our hearts can be just as damaging as the complacency we have in our relationship with other people. When we abrogate our one responsibility to be decent to one another, we open the door for other people to abrogate that responsibility as well. We go through life trying to match the energy of the people we encounter and inadvertently end up doing more damage than we intend. For a long time, I based my attitude on the attitudes that were shown to me. In college, I resigned from an extracurricular activity so that I could focus on my senior year. And the vice president of enrollment, who was my boss's boss at the time, asked me if I was serious about resigning. When I affirmed, he proceeded to shred the letter up right in front of me, in front of the other staff, one of which was his wife. She didn't say anything. She just sat there. Then he told me that I was living in a bubble and that I was in for a rude awakening once I'd graduated, and that he could replace me 10 times over. Thanks, boss. That was just the encouragement I needed to succeed. Then, to add insult to injury, within mere minutes of everything else that had happened, he told me that my supervisor had grave concerns about my work, that I had missed deadlines, that I wasn't meeting them, that my work was suffering. Really? Like that timing wasn't questionable. He began to write out a list of my work assignments as he cooked up these accusations against me. It was completely insane. At the end of the meeting, he said I'd be suspended until a more thorough review of my work was conducted. I left and immediately called my supervisor. I wanted to apologize if I was making mistakes, because this was the first I'd heard about it. I was noticeably flustered. She slowed me down and said, "JD, I haven't spoken to the VP of enrollment in weeks, and I absolutely have not called your work into question, not once." Was I surprised he lied? No. I didn't know what to do. I was finally encouraged to talk to someone in human resources, and so I did. And then the VP called me into another meeting. He said, "Going to HR was a big mistake. You're fired." There were people in that office that worked for him that knew he was crossing the line, and they said nothing. They did nothing. I don't blame them though. When you work in a toxic environment, the Black kid who found himself at odds with the VP was the last person you try to save. I don't blame them. What I learned from that experience is that having a good or positive attitude is hard when everything seems stacked against you. In a world where minorities are treated as less than human, I should not have been surprised that this happened to me. About a week after that, he called me back into his office. His attitude seemed to have shifted. He brought along the VP of student development for backup, a witness. It's not my job. But he just began to spew more lies. And then he started crying. He was crying. He was literally crying as if I had somehow wronged him. I didn't know what to think of that. The vice president of student development couldn't have even been bothered to look away from his phone. And it wasn't until the angry Black man made a guest appearance that he even noticed I was there. Yep, this was during the angry Black man season. When I left that meeting, I could hardly contain the temper that was burning a hole through my soul. The savagery of it all. No other student had ever been subject to something like that. What made me different? I was seen as a leader by so many people on campus, and here I was being taken to the gallows. But I remember what I said earlier. People often reciprocate the attitudes that are thrust upon them. About a week after that, he called me into his office one last time for one last meeting. And why I thought he was prepared to give me my job back, a job I loved, by the way, was a mystery to me. I was the unofficial official campus photographer and also the resident Apple expert. He didn't know how to access the pictures on the MacBook, all the pictures that I'd taken. A few months prior to all this happening, he'd asked me to show him how to do certain things in PowerPoint and Excel. I tried to walk him through it, but he wasn't getting it. He finally just told me to do it myself. So I did it and explained what I had done. And he said, okay. I got up and we traded seats and he saved it. And then he submitted it into a Blackboard account. Turns out it was an assignment for his master's degree. I was shocked, but hey. But here we were, trying once again to use me and to no end. But I'd had enough. With a smile on my face and a few choice keystrokes, I'd completely formatted the drive with all the pictures on it. Was I wrong? Maybe. 2 wrongs don't make a right, but back then it was all, fool me twice, shame on you. I walked around depressed for a long time after that. A heart full of hatred and a fist full of blood. To get to one side of the small campus to the other, I had to wear headphones just to avoid the noise. I hid the pain behind a crass attitude and a steely visage. Part 3, on the basis of identity. I guess in the end, you start to think about the beginning. In chapter 1, I talked about being stronger at the broken places. Do you remember what I said? How it's a thing where people equate it to strength. The way that a bone breaks and remodels, how it's stronger at the point of that fracture. It is, but just for a short time. The bone needs to heal. It needs to get back to the same tensile strength it once had, and to do that, to get back to what it once was, it has to cocoon itself in calcium and osteon so that while it heals, it can't be acted on by outside forces. It's an internal process that lasts for as long as it needs to, and once it's done what it needs to do, the tensile strength returns to what it used to be, whole and without fault. It took me a long time to heal. It took me a long while to be okay with everything that had happened. It took me a long while to get back the peace I once had an abundance of. It took me a long time to break chains and old habits, and once I did, I found myself again. I forgave a lot of people, some in person, some in heart. People like the 88%, the jokesters, the question askers, the permission seekers, Bruce and his friends, and now even the vice president of enrollment. I forgave them because it's what I needed for me, so that I could become the person I was meant to be. I had been used and abused long enough, and it was time I reclaimed my identity. It was time for me to remember what I already knew to be true. I am better than that. They say that time heals all wounds. And I didn't know that was true until I knew it was true. Black men and women all across this country every day are faced with one dilemma after the next. They are tested again and again, and many times they fail those tests. But if and when they do, they get up having learned something more than valuable, and they get to work bettering themselves. They do this because the alternative is not really a choice. It's been years since Black people have known a collective peace. It's been years. There is no silver bullet and there is no secret elixir. It's just people, broken and bare. And just as we have to acknowledge that certain kinds of evil exist, we equally have to acknowledge that certain kinds of righteousness also exist. And together in tandem, they weave a delicate coexistence that drives us closer together as people, as a human race. Some people may assume that I wrote this in an effort to air dirty laundry or to shame someone who was or wasn't deserving of it. But it wasn't. It was to show how far some people were willing to go to marginalize someone else. How far someone was willing to go to make sure someone felt inferior to them. It was to show how silence is sometimes complicity and how voices can get lost in dark places and dim settings. It was to show that if it could happen to me, it could happen to other people. The difference is I'm alive to shed light on how I was demonized and vilified. I get to live and speak for those who otherwise can't. I can keep having hard conversations because I, unlike so many others, I was afforded the opportunity to heal. I said earlier that people are oftentimes stronger at the broken places. Maybe after all of this I was wrong. No, in fact, I am wrong. People aren't stronger there. I think people are actually fragile at the broken places. Yeah, that's it. Fragile at the broken places. Here endeth the lesson. This episode of the Hyman Podcast was written, produced, and edited by myself. Special thanks to Kevin Aki, our brand designer. The essence of this podcast would not exist without him or his vision. Special thanks also to Chase Smith for believing in me enough to pursue me until I made this happen. I would also like to thank Whitney Hall, Sherith Guest, Mary Louise Layton, Sam Byram, Brittany Krivak, Tanya Forsyth, Daniel Edgington, Justin Hyman, Tara Hyman, Anthony Williams, Brooks May, Grant Furness, Lana Kondorova, Hunter McGonigal, and Tori Lamon. The theme song Canary was composed and produced by Jim Yosef. Music from this episode was composed and produced by Raphael Crux, with additional music licensed from Epidemic Sound. The Hyman Podcast is produced in part by Press Play Podcasts. Press Play is staffed by Chase Smith, our CEO and fearless leader. I serve as Chief Operating Officer, and Brooks May is the Head of Content and Development. To learn more about the network, sponsorships, guest appearances, or if you're interested in launching your own podcast on our network, visit us on the web at www.pressplaypodcast.com. Promotional consideration for this season of the Hyman Podcast was paid for by Blank Shell Gaming, Grant Furnace Designs, and Buds and Bloom, New York. To learn more about this podcast, our mission and vision, as well as our sponsors, please visit us on the web at www.jdhyman.com. Thanks for joining me on this journey. I'll see you next season.